I'm Frank Sysyn, director of the Peter Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta, and also a professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religious Studies. Uh, Today, our institute will have the pleasure of sponsoring the first, to my knowledge, event dealing with Belarus and some comparative aspects of Belarus and Ukraine. Although we have in the past worked on historical projects together with Belarusian historians, particularly in doing our major Hrushevsky project, we have not had, I think, the attention that Belarus is due given these experiences. Uh, Above all, we have the great opportunity of having Professor David Marples, Distinguished Professor at the Department of History and Classics of the University of Alberta, and a Research Fellow of our Institute, and a well-known scholar of both Belarus and Ukraine, uh, who can today fill us in both on the historical but above all on the present context of the war and what it means for Belarus and for Ukraine. Professor Marples is the former president of the North American Association for Belarusian Studies, and he also served as director of the Stasiuk program on contemporary Ukraine at our institute. He has served as a consultant on Belarus to a wide array of government and non-governmental organizations, including the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Embassy in Minsk, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade of Canada. He is well known for his early work on Chernobyl, also a topic that is, as we know, right on the border of Belarusian and uh, Ukrainian connections. He has, since that time, written over 20 works, either authored or co-authored, dealing with Ukraine, Belarus, and at times Russia as well. Of his many publications, I would like to point out a very interesting one, Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, a memoir. I think those of you after this event, I think will be interested in seeing his deeper context and writings of how he has dealt in his career and scholarly career with these two countries. He also has just published about a co as a co-author a handbook on what one needs to know about Belarus. And certainly a wide array of scholars and general public who had paid relatively little attention to Belarus, I think are snapping up this publication as Belarus enters such an important phase in East Central European affairs and in Eurasian studies. But perhaps as we begin today, I'd like to explore the journey of the scholar. That is, Professor Marples began his career and his first research on a dissertation dealing with Ukraine, and for many years was chiefly involved with dealing with Ukraine, and then gravitated to the field of Belarusian studies. And what I'm curious is to what degree he found something unexpected in this gravitation, to what degree this was a jump in his scholarship or thinking, and to what degree it changed his vision by devoting more attention to Belarus after his first and initial attention to Ukraine. So, David, if I may ask you for your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thank you. And it's very good to be here to talk to you today. I would say, the first thing I noticed in Belarus was back in April 1992. That was the first time I ever went to Belarus. It was for a conference on Chernobyl, and it was hosted by a charitable organization for the children of Belarus. And I'd met this group briefly in Washington, D.C., while I was attending a panel on the same topic about Ukraine. And I was asked, why are you always focusing on Ukraine? Why don't you ever come to Belarus? And I said, well, if you invite me, I will come. And they invited me to this conference. Everything seemed rather quiet. Um, the streets were fairly empty back at that time. And if you remember, 1992, Belarus had declared independence. Lukashenko was not president. In fact, there was no president. And there was a sort of debate at that time about where they were going to go, where society should go. And Chernobyl was one of the areas where people were concerned because of the fallout, particularly of radioactive iodine. And thyroid cancer among children was just becoming a real problem for Belarus at that time. Compared to Ukraine, also, there were not many scholars working on Belarus in the 1990s, I would say. I mean, I got to know pretty well all of them. A couple from Germany, actually, and another from France, who came to Belarus regularly at the same times that I did. Um, Actually, the number of scholars did gradually increase, but at first it was a very low number. And in North America as well, I met Kurt Woolheiser, fairly well known to people at an early stage, but I didn't know many people who were studying Belarus. So it was really like I was completely lost initially um, in this new environment. I mean, in Ukraine and in Ukrainian studies, I knew a lot of people by that time and it was well developed, but Belarus wasn't. And I think at that time as well, we were reliant on, the textbook by Jan Zaprudnik. There was a much earlier one by Vakar, which had focused on sort of the Russian angle of Belarus. Belarus is part of the Russian Empire. And Zaprudnik's book, for me was the first one that really looked at Belarus in a Belarusian light rather than an imperial Russian one. At the time as well, I think, when I first went there, aside from Chernobyl, the other big topics were the state of the national language, how to resurrect it, basically, and the reluctance of the authorities to investigate crimes of the Stalin period, particularly the mass burial site at Kuropati, which is about 15 kilometers north of the main city of Minsk. It's on the outskirts now. It was just outside the city back in the 1930s, where between 1937 and 41, something like 30,000 people had been executed by the NKVD. Zenon Pazniak, later the head of the Popular Front, was one of the ones who revisited this site and wrote a famous article about it in the literary newspaper, I believe in 1988. And that's a similarity, of course, because the literary newspaper in Ukraine was really one of the pioneers of glasnost in Ukraine. And in the same way, this happened in Belarus, but it wasn't easy. And when they published this article, the government was obliged to set up a commission to investigate Kuropati. But the commission included Pazniak, but it also included members of the KGB, the Soviet military, and the Soviet security forces. So in many ways, the very people who were responsible, or their ancestors were responsible for the massacres that originally occurred. So that was the sort of environment that I entered when I first started working on Belarus.
And did anything particularly come unexpected, or you had a model, a Ukrainian vision that you then applied to Belarus or found worked or didn't work?
Well, it was much more difficult to find sources until I got to know more people. When I first went there for this conference, everybody was billeted with a family, and I got to know my family, but not much else outside that family. But then I started to go back independently and began to explore further, and eventually got access to the National Archives. They also had opened this excellent library, which many Belarusians will be familiar with. So it was possible to go there as well. The KGB archives were off limits in 1994, so I didn't go in those first 2 years when they were open. It wasn't something that occurred to me at the time. Had I known they were going to close in 1994, then of course I would have done. So that was more difficult. And I think also um, Ukrainians have very large diaspora organizations, very large numbers in the diaspora compared to Belarusians. For Belarus, there's a small diaspora in the eastern part of the United States, sort of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York area. There are isolated little groups elsewhere. In Canada, at the time, I wasn't aware of any major organizations other than the government in exile, which was headed by Ivanka Savila then, as it is today. Remarkably, actually, nearly 25, 35 years later. Um, but these things were in their infancy, and I think they've developed now, but they weren't really obvious to me then. So I was dealing with, let's say, people in the radical fringes of society from the very outset, people who were determined to push the Popular Front, people who were determined to investigate Chernobyl, and therefore government access was much more difficult to deal with, to communicate with. I always remember I gave an early lecture at the European Humanities University, which at that time was based in Minsk, and there were people there from the government. And when I started speaking, they all walked out. And, I had no idea quite what to make of this, but I just carried on talking. And the audience itself was fairly receptive. So it was more difficult in that kind of respect, difficult to get information, difficult to find contacts. But I built them up gradually.
Thank you. I'd like to point out to our public that we will have Q&A after we finish our short discussion. Please put up questions, and I am sure that will add to our general discussion. Now, I turn then maybe to something that is my bailiwick, the earlier period, to say that Belarusians and Ukrainians have closely related languages, cultures for a long period of time, and indeed shared a common name as Rusyny for a large part of their history. Yet, their modern and contemporary histories have been really quite different. And I wonder if you would outline for our public, what do you see as the similarities of this modern and contemporary history, and what do you see as divergences and differences?
Yes, it's an important question. The two countries obviously have a lot of things in common, not least the similarity of their languages. But I think the Belarusians have always been a part, since medieval times anyway, of major empires. The period that's most discussed, I would say, particularly in the opposition, is the period of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, when it did seem that the Belarusian population, in terms of the written word, was somewhat in advance of the Lithuanian. And the leaders were using an older version of Belarusian, what was known as Old East Slavic, as the main language in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And we should also recall that there were some developments such as the translation of the Bible, the first book, as we know, printed in Belarus by Francis Scarina, which is commemorated outside the National Library with his statue today. So at least that much is remembered. But then things go into a kind of dark period when the Russian Empire took over most of Belarusian lands in 1795 with the third elimination of Poland, basically from the map of Europe. And by 1830-31, with a mass uprising, Belarusians joining in with the Poles against the Russians, the language and anything to do with the Belarusian culture were then banned until 1905. So that was a long 19th century for Belarusians. I think you can find some evidence that in the 19th century there was plenty of activity in Ukrainian lands, even though covertly. Like Ukrainians, Belarusians historically were a rural people, and they didn't have the numbers the Ukrainians had. And in fact, for a time, even the official languages early in the 20th century, they had to share that situation with Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. I mean, Belarusian was one of four major languages of the first Belarusian state when it was declared in 1918. But historically, most of these rural regions where Belarusians lived were illiterate, and the towns, as far as they did exist, were made up of Russians, Poles, and Jews. And in the 20th century, when there was a period of independence, March 25th, 1918 is still celebrated as the National Independence Day of Belarus by most people in the diaspora, by most people in the opposition as well. It didn't last very long, just a matter of a few weeks. And in this period, eventually, of Russian civil war, the Soviets eventually took over, and gradually Belarus began to become larger in size. But once the Soviets did take over, Lenin encouraged the formation of a Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, as he did in Ukraine. This is actually what Putin is most annoyed about today, I think, the fact that these republics were created within the Soviet Union rather than a Russian federalist state. And this period, the 1920s, saw a rapid development of language and culture under the official policy of indigenization. And this policy included the creation of the Belarusian State University in 1921. It became, excuse me, no, and then the Institute of Belarusian Culture in the following year. And it was the Institute of Culture that was eventually transformed into the Academy of Sciences of Belarus by 1929. So in that period, things began to develop quite rapidly until Stalin became firmly in power. And then in the early 1930s, everything was reversed. Modifications were made to the language, which had been standardized, and these modifications brought it closer to Russian. And in the 1930s as well, although both Ukraine and Belarus suffered dramatic events in the 1930s, Belarus found it very hard to recover in a later period. I think you could say in Ukraine, I mean, much was preserved by the western part of Ukraine where national consciousness was high and they were under Polish rule in that interwar period. But in Belarus, you had what was called the Night of the Murdered Poets in 1937, where about 100 poets and writers were executed in a single night, and also the purges themselves, which targeted not only the party and government leadership, but predominantly the rural people, the so-called kulaks, who died in tens of thousands. And it was obviously going to be difficult to rebuild on this progress in the future period. And that was followed almost immediately by the start of the war, when Belarusian territories fell under German rule in 1941. I missed out the reunification of Western and Eastern Belarus there, but by and large, once the Nazis took over Belarus, then you had another horrific period of destruction and also eventually resistance with the partisan movement that developed in late 1941 to 42. And I think the Soviet regime developed a kind of myth about the partisans that has never really decreased, and obviously has taken different shapes over the years. And they become somewhat sacrosanct to the population. I would say in Ukraine, there are different views of the so-called Great Patriotic War, where you've got people who supported resistance to the Soviets that went on after the war into the early 1950s. In Belarus, you did have some kind of guerrilla resistance too, but nothing like on the same scale. And the war became almost a sort of defining period of what it meant to be a Belarusian in the Soviet period, and to some extent under Lukashenka as well. And then in the 60s and 70s, what in Ukraine is known as the period of Shistoshyatniki and dissident movement. In Belarus, I would say by contrast, more focus is on an uncorrupt communist leader like Pyotr Masherov, who was notably resistant to some of the infringements of the Brezhnev hierarchy in Moscow, and genuinely quite popular. Also, in this same period, you have heavy Russification of the media, of public life, of schools, education system as a whole, and Belarusian language started to disappear again. I would also say you had about 5 years, 1990 to 95, where Belarusian was the national language. It was the only state language up until that period. But under Lukashenko, things have really uh, more or less gone back to Soviet times in terms of the language and culture, and also the affinity and alignment with Russian interests has been emphasized as well. Whereas I think in Ukraine, not immediately perhaps, but gradually, Ukraine has moved completely out of the sphere of Russian control. So these are the contrasting periods. It doesn't mean that there is not a strong democratic opposition in Belarus, which we might talk about a bit later. But it's peripheral compared to how strong the movement developed in Ukraine.
And maybe we can turn to that opposition. We can say that the elections and peaceful protests in 2020 captured the attention of the world. I think many first found out about the existence of Belarus during that period. And yet they ended without a change of government. How do you evaluate the tactics of the opposition? And what do you see as the roots of Lukashenko's staying power?
Yeah, I mean, I would say first that during Lukashenko's long rule, which is now in its 32nd year, almost entered its 33rd year, there was always opposition to Lukashenko. I mean, it really probably comprised, according to reliable polls of the time taken inside Belarus, roughly 20 to 25% of the population. And that never went away. But the only time it could really make any kind of public showing was during election campaigns. In 1994, it was a fairly democratic election. Um, But then the rules began to change as referendums changed the constitution. Lukashenko reinserted himself in 1996, ruled until 2001 when the opposition found it very difficult to come up with a candidate, and did so belatedly, but not really in time to make an impact. But in 2006 and 2010, there were strong opposition campaigns to Lukashenko. Um, and this is what you might call the orthodox opposition based in traditional political parties, of which Belarus had very many. For example, there were three social democratic parties at one stage, two wings of the Popular Front by 1999, and other parties as well. But the situation changed in 2020 for a couple of reasons. One, I think, was the COVID pandemic, which had not been recognized by the regime. In fact, Lukashenko dismissed it and told people to go to the countryside and drink vodka and that there was no real danger from COVID. At the same time that many people were dying of it. And then he held an election campaign right in the middle of the COVID virus in August 2020. This infuriated people. And I think as well, what you also see in 2020 is the emergence of what you might call a social media generation. That is, groups that were young people used to communicating by social media with things like the Telegram channel Nectar, which the government had no control over and could organize opposition once it became needed. During the election itself, Lukashenko tried to eliminate the opposition by arresting them or forcing them to flee the country. And Svetlana Tsikhanovskaya was the only person whom he allowed to run. He never really feared a woman running against him. And in fact, he claimed she was really got no right to run because women didn't do military service and therefore they had no right to run as president. But nevertheless, she was the wife of one of the original candidates and he was imprisoned along with the other candidates. And together with the other two major opposition teams, she formed a little alliance with Maria Kolesnikova and Veronika Sapkala. And they kind of went around together as a trio campaigning in what was a very popular campaign. They were getting crowds of up to 60,000 in Minsk itself, slightly less in other cities. And it was obvious that this was a campaign that was not really based on traditional themes of nationalism or language rights or even membership of the EU. It was simply, we want a democratic election, and we will, after this election, hold another one to free people who've been imprisoned under the monitoring of international observers, and that this would be the first real free election since 1994. And it almost worked. But when the results were announced, Lukashenko claimed that he'd won more than 80% of the vote and had Tsikhanovsky down around 9 to 10%. It was obviously fabricated, and it was so obvious that it led to mass protests in the streets. And it was in the streets that you began to see the old national flag re-emerge for the first time. Hadn't seen it during the election campaign. Sometimes the EU flag was there. The EU and Western countries were very supportive in many ways, but didn't join in the same way that they'd done, I think, in Ukraine in 2014. It was a peaceful demonstration, and I think that alone delineates it from the demonstrations in Ukraine, which had turned violent by February of 2014 and led to hundreds of deaths ultimately. And conversely, by being nonviolent, it gave Lukashenko an opportunity to regroup as long as his forces remained loyal to him. And the security forces, to some extent, did. I would say of the groups that joined the opposition, the diplomatic corps were probably the most observable, particularly in foreign embassies where the votes for Tsikhanovskaya could be counted and were obviously a landslide in her favor. The security services were kind of split. Some left the country, organizations abroad, but the security forces to some extent stayed in place. And Tsikhanovskaya herself left Minsk 2 days after the election. And I think that did make a psychological difference in rallying support for her within Belarus. And there was no immediate prospect of her being able to return. She left really because she was afraid of the future of her children, who had been taken out to Lithuania. And therefore, the campaign couldn't go on as it was. And the Belarusians eventually decided not to go on strike. That, I think, was the major turning point of the demonstrations. Had they done so, they could have brought down Lukashenko. Had they resorted to violence? Yes, probably. But I think that would have left an unfortunate precedent had they used violence. I mean, they won the admiration of the world largely by not being violent. And all sectors of society took part in these protests, particularly women. Women played an extremely prominent part, as they had done during the election, but also pensioners, people who could go all the way back to the Patriotic War and later periods of the Soviet Union, also joined in. And they were really prevented from doing anything by Russian involvement in these elections and the Russian threat to use force to keep Lukashenko in power if he was removed. And this is something quite ominous for a nation of 9 million people. The threat of a Russian invasion, maybe 500,000 army entering your territory and taking it over, there would be no prospect of getting it back. Unlike in Ukraine, where eventually Ukraine has now gained the upper hand in many aspects of the war, it couldn't happen in Belarus. So once Putin had stated that he was supporting Lukashenko, that really kept Lukashenko in power. Putin also provided an immediate loan of $500 million, and that kept the Minsk regime afloat. And eventually Lukashenko basically nominated himself as president again. His ceremony was conducted entirely by himself, and the Western powers and many people in Belarus have never recognized him as a legitimate president. But now most of the opposition in Belarus belongs in the exile community of 600,000 to 1 million, resident in Lithuania, Poland, and perhaps the Czech Republic and other countries, but mainly those first two. So unfortunately, it didn't succeed, but it's hardly forgotten, and I don't think it will be forgotten.
So thank you. Maybe we can turn to the war. Would you give us a sketch of Belarusian politics and policies from the Maidan and the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and then up to the full-scale invasion and beyond? That is, how do you see the policies of Belarus developing? What changes have there been in it? And obviously, what the role of Lukashenko was during these events.
Yeah. Um, I would say first that we need to keep in mind that in 1999, a Russian-Belarus union was established between Presidents Yeltsin and Lukashenko, which never really had any meaning, I think, until Putin came to power in 2000. And by 2003 to 4, he was already beginning to try to um, put in place policies that would lead to the assimilation of Belarus into Russia. I mean, he referred to Belarus as a Western province and said that if the two ever formed a complete union, Belarus would be part of Russia. It would not be separate from Russia. And that was seen as an immediate threat by Lukashenko. Also, there was a history of disputes, mainly over oil and gas prices that Russia was charging to sell oil to Belarus where it was refined and then resold to European buyers. And Belarus made large profits from doing that. And this began to change because Russia began to use world oil and gas prices for Belarus as well. So there was a degree of, I wouldn't say animosity, but a small rift between Minsk and Moscow over some of these issues. And Belarus was very reluctant to be integrated fully into these Russian-led organizations, such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization or even the Eurasian Union. It was a member, but there was always a sort of hesitancy in Belarus, and it was the same when the Russians annexed Crimea. At first, Lukashenko seemed to support it. You know, Crimea has always been a part of Russia. We know that. And then there was a hesitancy. And then Lukashenko offered to mediate, or at least have Belarus as a mediating ground in the war in the Donbass, where the two Minsk agreements were signed in September 2014, March 2015. They were both held in Minsk, which might be symbolic, but it suggested that Lukashenko didn't perceive his role as an ally of Russia per se. He saw his role more as one to kind of stop the fighting between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And this kind of belief persisted, I think. Sometimes in the UN, you see votes on Crimea, which are condemned by the Western countries, by Japan and others in the United Nations, and Belarus remaining abstaining from a vote. It's quite noticeable that they did this. But in 2022, it was somewhat different because Belarusian troops and Russian troops had been organizing exercises under the Zapad campaigns every few years. There was one in 2017, for example. But in 2022, the exercises, I think it was called Operation Resolve, or Public Resolve, something like that, Unified Resolve, were intended by Russia as a kind of prelude to the invasion of Ukraine. There's no real evidence that initially Belarus knew that was the plan, that the plan was to invade Ukraine directly after these exercises took place. But once that invasion started, Lukashenko was right behind it. And he gave access to Russia to use Belarusian facilities to help the war. Rockets were fired from Belarus directly into Ukrainian cities like Chernihiv, which got a massive bombing. And also, if Russian soldiers were injured in the war, they were taken to Belarusian hospitals. And Belarusian railroads were used to convey materials to the Russian army. So this was a significant aid, even though the Belarusian army itself was not included in that package. It did not take part in the war. Largely, I think, because it would have been highly unpopular. Lukashenko had always tried to keep the Belarusians out of wars. And he feared that he might be overthrown if he did send in the army into the war. But gradually, his position, even in this war, has begun to change once it was recognized that Russia wouldn't win in 3 to 5 days, as it originally thought it could do. And you note that when Prigozhin had his rebellion against Putin in 2023, Lukashenko intervened again as a sort of mediator and agreed that the Wagner division and Prigozhin could be housed on Belarusian territory. They could stay on Belarusian territory and, they could have exercises for whatever they were going to do in Central Africa or Syria or wherever else they were going to be sent. So once again, you have a situation where Lukashenko is taking on this new role as a mediator rather than a participant. He doesn't want to take part in this war. And now it's going badly. There's even less willingness to join in. I mean, there's simply no way now that Lukashenko would want to join in. But Russia very strongly is putting pressure on him to do so. I think also Russia is now using Belarusian oil refineries. Ironically, the Russian oil that is exported to Belarus is refined and sent back to Russia because Russian oil refineries are being destroyed by Ukrainian drones. So it's perhaps the ultimate irony that Russia now needs Belarus economically less than militarily. I'll stop there, Frank.
Okay, yes, but perhaps talking about the degree to which Lukashenko seemed to back down to Zelensky's
Hmm.
admonitions and then threats in a certain way of how Belarus would be treated. What I am interested in is I realize we have minimal ability to know what public opinion is in Belarus. Uh, what you've outlined for us, I think, succinctly and very informatively, is where the government attitudes were. Do we have any indications of what the Belarusian population, how it's responded to it? How it's responded in general to how Ukraine has responded to the first Russian invasion and then later to the full-scale invasion. And do you see a change in attitudes among the general population?
I think we have some evidence. I mean, it's very hard because any kind of survey that can be conducted is always online. And again, it's from a very narrow base. Chatham House has done some surveys. There are people like Kabaletsky who's done some surveys. Um, Others in Volodymyr, for example, in Warsaw as well. Um, their conclusions are that Belarusians have been bombarded with Russian propaganda. Now that all the independent Belarusian outlets are either in exile or shut down inside Belarus, the population only gets Russian propaganda on a full scale, nothing else. So it's not so surprising that many Belarusians in 2014 actually supported the annexation of Crimea and to some extent the Russian war in the Donbass. And I think that is clear. I mean, they mainly listen to Russian Belarusian television, they watch YouTube, Russian channels, Telegram Russian channels, etc. So this is where they get their news from. And that's a significant problem. It doesn't apply to the exiles or people who can pick up Western information. But even the people in the country are opposed to Belarus joining in the war. And that is absolutely clear. And a further group of Russians, mainly from Warsaw and other places, joined the war on the Ukrainian side for the Kalinovsky Brigade. And there's a couple of other brigades in Ukraine as well, which have become part of the Ukrainian army. They're subjected to Ukrainian officers and follow the rules of Ukrainian officers, but they operate as a Belarusian division with a distinct uniform. So Belarus is divided in that regard on where it stands on what's happening in Ukraine. I think in terms of more recent events, Belarusians are concerned by the intrusion of drones into their territory. and sometimes landing in public areas. And it doesn't really matter whether these drones are fired from Russia or whether they're fired from Ukraine. If they land on Belarusian territory, it's a concern. And the Belarusian authorities have acknowledged that they cannot intercept Ukrainian drones. They don't have the technology to do it. And they're flying at too low an altitude to be intercepted by anything that Belarus has got today. Putin has recognized that, and he started to build up Russian weaponry on bases inside Belarus. The Oreshnik missile, one of the heaviest missiles in the Russian weaponry, is now in Belarus as well. And from all indications, this is a concern for Belarusians as well, to have such weaponry on their territory. It makes them a viable target. And what Zelensky was complaining about were the relay stations on the border, which could redirect Russian drones into Ukrainian territory. And that is why he demanded, he said, if you don't remove them within a week, we're going to do it for you. And they were immediately switched off, which suggests to me that in the leadership, Belarus has no answer. It doesn't want to take part in a war with Ukraine from official levels downward. There's no preference for that at all. Ukrainians and Belarusians historically, at least in the 20th century, have had good relations. Even the period of Viktor Yushchenko, for example, had very cordial relations with Lukashenko. Surprisingly, perhaps, but he did. So there's no animosity on that level. And notably as well, Ukraine kept its embassy open in Minsk right up until the early 2020-21 period. And I believe even later, because it was Zelensky who changed policy in early 2026 when he issued sanctions on Lukashenko for the first time, organized meetings with the opposition, and began to consider Lukashenko an enemy rather than a sort of neutral or even potential friend. And maybe, his position is from one of fear now, that Belarus could get dragged into something that would absolutely destroy it. Whichever way you look at it, if Belarus joins in the war, it gets destroyed. It either ends up being part of Russia, but it's certainly going to be the end of the independent state. So I think the population realize that, and they're opposed to the war. I can't tell from recent polls where the level of support lies now for the Russian army in Ukraine. I suspect it's falling just as it is elsewhere.
And maybe a little bit more about how you evaluate Ukraine's policy towards Belarus. That is, the varying Ukrainian governments that have come since 2014. Was Belarus in some ways neglected by them? How much attention was paid to it? And do you see these policies of Ukraine changing at the moment? Obviously, with these threats and admonitions the way it were.
Yeah, I mean, in 2014, Ukraine's policy to Belarus didn't really change. I mean, they continued to trade just as they'd done before. Yes, Belarus, to some extent, supported Russia insofar as it could, but it didn't help them in any meaningful way. So I think, as far as I can tell, that in 2014 to 21, say, relations did continue on a fairly amicable sort of basis, with concern, of course, for what was happening in Ukraine. But I think the policies now in Ukraine have changed because it's irritating, particularly to Zelensky, that Belarus is always there. I mean, Russia's looking for a base for tactical nuclear weapons. Send them to Belarus. It's got once Oreshnik missiles on Belarusian territory. Fair enough. Everybody agrees. Send them there. And so Ukraine starts to see Belarus as a belligerent rather than a neutral. Changed position completely by 2026. And therefore, everything begins to change. The whole attitude to Belarus begins to change. And, if you ask any exiles how they're treated in different lands, many of them will say that when we go to, say, Lithuania or when we go to Ukraine, people treat us badly because they identify exiles with the government of Belarus, which is seen as part of the government of Russia or Russian policy. Maybe that will begin to change now that the Ukrainian government has begun to deal with the opposition directly. But this was an unfortunate legacy and denied the fact that there are in fact today two Belaruses. There's an official regime in Minsk, which is arresting people on a daily basis, uh, cutting human rights, and the exiles abroad growing in number, where you've got really, in many respects, the cream of Belarusian society, young people, well educated, who are prepared to move around. The question is, will those exiles eventually go back home, or will they stay in their new environments? Because the future makeup of Belarus will depend on that. If you've got sort of 1/9 of the population outside the country, and also not including, say, the older generation, where people perhaps still have stood by Lukashenko for years and years, then this is the future of Belarus. These are the people that Ukraine and other countries should be dealing with. And finally, they are seeming to do that. But I think it needs to be recognized internationally as well. We see today, you didn't ask me this, but I'll add it because the Trump presidency is dealing directly now with the Lukashenko administration. It's had maybe 10 meetings in Minsk directly since the start of 2025, and it's ended with the release of about 650 political prisoners. But it also has relieved a lot of tension on Lukashenko by removing sanctions of the US on Belarus. Also allowing Belarus to use its airline again to get parts from the United States, allowing Belarus to export potash, and putting pressure on the Europeans to open their ports to Belarusian goods. So this is a further factor that needs to be taken into consideration. And the Trump administration is not an enemy of Russia by any means. I mean, it's continually allowed Putin a lot of leeway and given him a lot of credibility by recognizing him and recognizing his presidency.
Yeah, I think by bringing in the U.S., you aim towards the last question I have before I'll open it up to us looking through the questions that are given by our audience. And that is, you don't have a crystal ball. I realize that. But what do you see where Belarus and Belarusian society will be positioned in the future in its various its relations with Russia, with Ukraine, with the USA, which you've begun to outline for us, at least what American policy was, and with the EU. Uh, we can't see the outcome of the war, which will be crucial for this. But what do you see as the basis for how these relations will develop? I think it was extremely interesting to hear the Trump regime or government's policies at the moment towards a fellow Lukashenko and towards Belarus. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is of course impossible to make predictions, which is why I'm happy to be an historian and not a political scientist. But you can say certain things. I mean, first of all, much does depend on the outcome of the war. And from my perspective, it's very hard to see how Russia can win this war. And if you'd asked me in 2022, I might not have given that sort of comment. But obviously, they've gained very little ground in eastern Ukraine for the past 2 years. I mean, many people have compared it with the trenches in the First World War in terms of the progress made. In other words, they kind of need some sort of catalyst. And in the trenches, they had the entry of the United States into the war by early 1918, and that made all the difference. Here, you don't have one. I don't think Putin has got an answer. If he introduces full conscription, it would be an extremely unpopular move and might even bring him out of power. And there's no guarantee that it would actually change anything. Also, in terms of the economy, Russia has managed so far because China has taken on importing Russian oil and gas. India's helped to some extent. But I think there's a limit to that aid as well. If the war is obviously getting nowhere, and trade with Europe seems to be permanently damaged, I think that Chinese support may waver as well, and that would be critical for Russia. Now, if Russia pulls out of this war, and on any kind of basis, then I think there's a number of options for Belarus in terms of either being a neutral country, non-aligned country like it was according to its original constitution, or even joining European structures to some extent. I don't see any immediate prospects of membership of the European Union, but it could conceivably be some kind of an associate member because trade with the EU was second after trade with Russia until the war started in 2014. It was a very high level and even continued to some extent till 2022. And therefore, it's a positive sign in that respect in terms of bringing some kind of democratic system to Belarus. Second point is most of the leaders of these countries that I've been discussing are dictators or near dictators. I'll leave it open for Trump, although I think he would like to be in that number as well. And I'm glad you described it as a regime rather than an administration. But they're also fairly elderly. They won't be around forever. And if you look at Putin today, the man of action of the early 21st century, pet tigers and jumping out of airplanes and things like that, he's a shadow of his former self. So who knows how long these people will remain? But in the long term, they will be long dead before most of the people who say took part in the uprising of 2020. And therefore, it's important to look at the kind of succession. Lukashenko has set up a system where People's Assembly has now really taken over from Parliament as sort of the arbiter of power if he steps down. And probably one of the reasons for that was so he doesn't get impeached or imprisoned or something like that. This has to be changed. And Belarus has to go back to some kind of democratic constitution in order to guarantee succession, because otherwise you will have Viktor Lukashenko or someone like that taking over as president when Lukashenko steps down. And that would be disastrous. The same to some extent in Russia, where you've got a really hierarchical system with Putin at the top. There's really a bunch of nobodies below Putin. There's nobody you could really think of who will be obviously a successor to Putin, and he wants it that way. So I think in Russia as well, there is some hope for change, if not some kind of disruption of the system that's been built up based on the wealth of oligarchs and criminal organizations and destruction of the opposition. So I'm not pessimistic. I think there's hope for some kind of change, but it does depend on the United States remaining a democratic country and representing the democratic views of countries abroad, giving support to NATO, to the EU, and acting again as some kind of a security force. Because gradually, although the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Australia, Japan, and others can contribute to some sort of support for Ukrainian security, there's going to be a gap before they can match what the US has offered up till now. And this is a critical period, I think, when they have to try and do that. But it would be good, to think about a post-Trump administration that's not going along the same kind of lines as now, in order to secure a more democratic environment worldwide in future.
Yeah, thank you. And now let's turn to some of the questions we have. Some of these issues have been covered already, but we'll see if you want to amplify on them. And in many ways, some want you to have the crystal ball that you don't have, but we'll see how you can deal with it. So Edward Baidu says, good morning. What are the perspectives of ordinary people on this war? Are there any poll results or opportunities to hear their views regarding the ongoing war? This, I think, you've covered earlier if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, hi Edward. Yeah, there aren't any polls as we would consider polls. There haven't been independent polls in Belarus since about 2016. You just simply cannot get realistic polls. What we can surmise is from people who travel, from people in exile who perhaps talk to their parents back home or other relatives and friends back home. I would say that Belarusians would like the war to end. They would like it to end without taking part in it themselves. They are not happy about the Russian military installations on their territory. They're not happy about Ukrainian drones going over their territory. They are basically a peaceful nation, and they would like to remain that way. But I do think that now that Ukraine has opened up to the opposition, some of those views might change. Um, but it is very hard to tell without a properly independent opinion poll, and we simply don't have that.
And then Anastasia Tolstaya gives us some information on the Belarusian community. Thank you for having Belarus as your research topic and your topic of interest in this discussion. I am a Belarusian member of the Belarusian Canadian Alliance, the oldest Belarusian diaspora organization in North America, founded in Toronto in 1948. Today, it is a nonprofit organization. And I think most important for CIUS, we have an Alberta chapter and a very active group in Edmonton. Uh, if you had any contacts with groups, then add to this. And if not, it's something that CIUS should follow up on.
Yeah, I've had contact with the Edmonton one, and I even joined them in one demonstration outside the legislature a few years ago. I'm also very aware of Anastasia. I'm always happy to get your comments on all kinds of subjects, and I hope that we can keep in touch in the future. I will certainly promote the alliance as far as I can. I noticed the Alberta organization has attracted the attention of the KGB, as shown in the Globe and Mail the other day, which I take as a good sign. But it's also a sign of something I didn't mention in the talk, and that is the proliferation of KGB activities outside Belarus. And I have a number of friends who've reported on even getting phone calls from KGB people to their private phones in European countries saying that, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to talk to your family. We'll maybe, think about their housing situation and things like that. So it's a serious problem. And it's not one that's gone away to any extent since 2020 and those events.
And for those who missed it, there was an article in the Globe and Mail, particularly on the targeting of Belarusians in Alberta, which I found interesting. Is so it must be show the activity of this community. Now we have a fairly lengthy account from Ethan Berger. David, I am trying to establish, sorry, a program to support Belarusian studies at Harvard. Initially, I will pay a small stipend out of pocket and then create a funding mechanism. I'm looking for appropriate applicants who might be studying at Harvard and writing about contemporary political studies similar to those of the Conference on Belarusian Studies. The recipient need not be a resident at Harvard. The individual could be elsewhere. And then goes on to describe this. You will have a copy of it. I might add that this initiative I think is extremely important, and of course, CIUS's partner in many ways, or twin, is the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which of course was established by funding from a general community. So if you would have any more comments on this and suggestions, we would add to it. I hope you can see the full question.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, I mean, hi, Ethan. Like nearly all these people I know personally, so it's very easy for me to answer these
Right.
questions. But I think, an initiative started a few years ago with a Center for Belarusian Studies in Winfield, Kansas, which basically petered out. Its director died prematurely. There's a huge need for a program on Belarusian studies, even a chair of Belarusian studies that really could promote it. And the American Slavists meeting in November, which has a group organized, among others, by Sasha Razor, who's also participating in this discussion. That was one thing I was thinking of raising, that we ought to have either a chair or a program of Belarusian studies at a major institution, and Harvard would be the ideal one. Toronto would be another. I think there'll be a lot of interest of, if there was one in Toronto, where I seem to remember a few years ago, a chair of Estonian studies was initiated. And I think if you can have a chair of Estonian studies representing such a small nation, it's possible to get one for Belarusian studies as well. But these things depend on, frankly, large donations. And it would be a case of directing all community efforts to one goal, and that is to set up a chair or a program that could really be run, as like the YATSIC program, for example, in Toronto, based on interest of endowments rather than the endowment itself. So you're not simply using the whole thing up in 10 years or something like that. So that's something for the future. Maybe if people would like to come to the meeting in November when the North American Association of Belarusian Studies is going to be reconstituted, that would be one of the topics that we will discuss. And that's in Chicago. I believe it's quite early in November, sort of in the middle of November.
And then we have, something in some ways closer to the things that I study, or your co-author of your new book. When, in your view, did Belarusians and Ukrainians begin to distinguish each other as members of different imagined national communities? Danilo Lishchishin asks.
Gosh, to answer this question with Frank here sitting in his chair is very difficult because he'd probably contradict whatever I say. I'm thinking, yeah, it's hard because you'd also have to ask, when do you see the beginning of Ukrainian history or Ukrainian national identity, which is often dated all, say back to the period of Kievan Rus in the 10th century. In many ways, Belarusian history dates back to the same period. I mean, many of the cities on the periphery of the Principality of Kiev existed from that time, like Turav is one, also other very old settlements, and developed from there. But you don't really, I think, in terms of Belarus, talk about national identities in that early period. You do see some developments, I think, in the shape of protests against Russian rule. In the 19th century, the uprisings, Kalinovsky uprising is one example. But it's really in the early 20th century, I think, that we can talk about it with the formation of the National Republic or People's Republic in March 1918. And I think then Belarusians and Ukrainians recognized that they were two separate people. And that was solidified, of course, ironically, by the Soviet republics when they were established as well by 2021, 22, when after that you always had separate republics. But you do get anomalies, and this is why you have a ethnic Ukrainian as president of Belarus for the past 32 years. And you also, not too long ago, had an ethnic Belarusian, Yanukovych, who has a native village in Belarus, as the president of Ukraine. So they do intersperse. And you also get places where the two languages are all mixed up, such as Poliske or Policia region, and also around Chernobyl region. You have a kind of, Syrzhik's really Russian Ukrainian, but it's a mixture of the languages there. So you can't actually identify precisely what they are saying or what they're speaking, what language they are speaking. But I do think they've been distinct from the 20th century onwards.
Okay, and as you posed it, I would place it earlier. I
Yes, of course.
will give my full views of it, but what I think is most interesting is the time that Belarusians are referred to as Lithuanians
Mm.
by the Ruthenians of the Ukrainian territories. as well as already discussions in the 17th century of differences in the language of these groups. But of course,
Mm.
we're dealing with elite groups who leave records. We're not talking about a broader segment of it. Then to go on, Leila Roldan Vasquez says, thank you for an excellent review of Belarus history and politics. There is a generalized concern over further involvement of Belarus in the Russian war on Ukraine. If Putin declares it a war and Belarus could be forced to participate according to its obligations under the 1999 treaty, creating a union state of Russia and Belarus. How do you see this possibility? Partially covered it, but if you want.
Yes, I mean, it's a good question. I partially covered it. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think there's any way that Lukashenko is going to send the Belarusian army into Ukraine. And frankly, I don't think it would make much difference if it did. And it would actually cause more danger to Belarus than would gain any benefit because it would immediately bring an attack of Ukrainian drones on Belarusian factories, enterprises, oil refineries, etc., which would diminish Belarus's economic capacity and also kill many people. That is widely recognized, and I think Russia is content at the moment with maintaining Lukashenko in power. As long as Lukashenko continues to follow Putin's path in rhetoric and without doing anything drastic to move away from that path, that is, Russia can continue to use facilities in Belarus and use Belarus as a kind of base for its weapons and sometimes its army. I think right now Russia only has about 2,000 troops in Belarus. So, that's not enough to constitute danger to the north of Ukraine. If that number suddenly increased or they start holding regular military exercises on Belarusian territory involving tens of thousands, that's a different matter. But it's not happened. And I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. I mean, theoretically, yes, it could. Or Putin could put a lot of pressure on Lukashenko to sort of agree to what he's saying. But it's still, if Lukashenko declines to do that, like he is doing now, I don't think it's enough to make Russia want to get rid of him as a leader. They still are comfortable with him in power, given what might happen if he's removed. So I think we're okay for now.
Okay, thank you. And Larissa Bilouz would like to know, is there any realistic path where U.S. outreach strengthens Belarusian independence from Moscow rather than just easing pressure on Lukashenko while the war is still going on? And do you see a risk that this kind of normalization becomes a template that later gets extended to Russia itself?
Yeah, I was concerned about that same question myself, and still am. I think, in theory, yes, it could strengthen independence, but I think more important than independence is that it gives Lukashenko room for maneuver. That is, it gives him an opportunity to pursue outlets other than complete dependence on Russia. Because after 2022, Lukashenko doesn't have many friends. He has North Korea or Iran, for example, but he doesn't have many friends in the sort of Western world. And in terms of traveling to meet people, it's been either Russia or China. I see, in theory, China also could be put into that category. If Belarus develops close ties with China, could it relieve its close ties with Belarus? And I think the answer to both is no, because at the moment there's no urgency for that on the part of China. China doesn't want to intervene where Russia is. It sees Russia as an important partner and is willing to lead Belarus to Russia. And also in terms of um, the United States, I think if it goes to a certain degree where it seems that Belarus is, it's been invited to what Trump calls a great deal, a big deal, and Lukashenko has been invited to Washington to come and meet Trump. But he didn't come to the meeting of the Peace Council, notably when he was invited. And the reason I think was he didn't want to offend Russia. He talked to Putin just before that. Doubtless Putin said, don't go, and he didn't go. So at the moment, I think Putin still is the commanding voice in most cases, other than the actual command to join in the war. So I think the US can go so far, but no further. And you're right, it does actually strengthen Lukashenko by recognizing him and not dealing with the opposition in any way at all. The opposition are not invited to these meetings between John Cole or Keith Kellogg earlier, but now John Cole and Lukashenko. There's no opposition representation. And that to me is a huge mistake by the Americans.
Thank you. Then we have an anonymous attendee. I think in part you've answered this. How do you see the Lukashenko succession? Who or what groups are the players within the country?
Well, at the moment, the only players in the country are the people in the Lukashenko administration. That is the president, the People's Assembly, and to a lesser extent, the Parliament and Council of the Republic. The chair of the Council of the Republic, Natalia Kachanova, has also played quite a prominent role in negotiations and various talks with Ukraine and others. Also, she went to meet Chinese officials as well. So maybe she should be considered as well if you consider a successor. But I also think the Lukashenko family has to be considered, particularly his two oldest sons. His youngest son is not old enough, in theory, to be the successor to Lukashenko, but the oldest two sons are, and they played prominent roles throughout Lukashenko's presidency. There are also people like Viktor Shaiman, who's been constantly around. He's also been behind some of the worst atrocities of the Lukashenko regime, particularly the killings of 1999-2000, when a number of people in the opposition who've been part of Lukashenko's administration were kidnapped and killed. These are all people who might be considered somewhere in the circle. Not included is anybody in the political opposition. Viktor Babarika, for example, probably the most popular politician in the 2020 election, is now in exile. Sikhanovskaya is in exile. Virtually everybody you can think of who's been prominent in the opposition, other than Mykolai Statkevich, who is back in Belarus now, but suffered a heart attack while he was imprisoned, and is really probably in no position to mount any kind of political campaign. So, seems to me right now, unless something changes, the successor is going to come from that group.
Okay, and now from John Paul Himka, did Soviet Belarusia suffer from the famine of the early 1930s?
Yes, I don't see that question in front of me, but it must be earlier. No, not to any great extent. In fact, many Ukrainian peasants in 1931, in an earlier period where there was drought in many Ukrainian regions, served as a resource base for Ukrainian peasants who were starving, and they went immediately to the Belarusian Republic. They crossed the border. And I think that was one reason why Stalin introduced the passport system in January 1933, which was to stop a similar thing happening again. Ukrainian peasants both traveling to towns in Ukraine that might have grain, but also traveling abroad to Belarus or even to the Russian Republic to find places where grain was more plentiful. Having said that, there's plenty of indication that people were going hungry. They just weren't starving to death on a mass scale. So it's a kind of yes or no answer. There was no mass famine like there was in Ukraine, in Belarus.
Okay, thank you. And I see that time is going forward. We may not get a chance to get through all of the questions. We will save them and see if the responses. But at the moment, from Nikolai Shpilkov. Hello, my name is Nikolai Shpilkov. I'm a doctoral researcher studying Belarusian national history curricula, working with the narrative dynamics from the 2000s to 2010s. I found out something like national liberationism of the discourse on Stalinism. For example, the old textbook of Novik is 100% pro-Stalin, and later textbooks by a group of authors openly criticize repressive policies and even open a discussion on the collectivization's price. How would you comment on this turn from your perspective?
Yeah, good question, Nikolai. I think it really depends on the freedom that's given to historical researchers over different periods of time. And you do find changes. I mean, I even noted, for example, that the national holiday, March 25th, was actually officially recognized 1 year prior to the current war situation, but it was recognized 1 year officially, which may have been to offset the unofficial one. But it does indicate that the Belarusian regime realizes that there are some events that were too catastrophic to gloss over. And Stalin's mass crimes are one of these. And, the scale of the suffering was such that it's kind of hard to talk about Belarus and not mention them. Some historians as well um, have focused on these, even in sort of national debates. I recall a national debate on Karapati a few years ago, which was organized by the editor of Russo-Ukrainian, the newspaper formerly Sovietskaya Belarusia, the presidential newspaper. And although it was very one-sided, they did allow for the opposite perspective of these crimes to be discussed as well, even though they clamped down on it by the end in the conclusion. So you do find it. These narratives change. But I think in the current period, when Russia and Belarus have now agreed, and they've actually published a common textbook on the Great Patriotic War, which keeps the narratives not only similar, but exactly the same for the first time, suggests to me that now national history is really become a political and legal issue, and that anyone who contravenes this official narrative could be subject to arrest. And that is taken quite literally. They would be arrested if they contravene this narrative. In other words, if they began to say things like, as earlier people did, oh, the partisans did commit crimes as well as showing great resistance to the Germans. Anathema today. People will be arrested for writing that. So I think what happened in that earlier period, unfortunately, is gone now. But I agree that there was some diversion. I've tried to actually purchase every textbook on the history of Belarus when I was traveling regularly to Minsk. I've not been there recently, so I've not been able to follow up. And I don't think there's a heck of a chance of my going now, since my co-author of my new book on Belarus has been convicted of terrorism and given a 10-year sentence in absentia. So the chances for my going back and checking up are pretty minimal.
So I'm glad to see the book. We will take one more question I will give, and then I wonder whether you would sum up what the book, its content, how it was created, and we'll see if I know a public that will then rush out to purchase it. So the last question I'll take from our questioners is, do people in Belarus, this is Michael Pirch, do people in Belarus perceive greater economic opportunity through a shift from dependence on Russian trade and integration toward deeper economic cooperation with the European Union? How do ordinary Belarusians weigh the potential benefits and risks of such a transition?
Yeah, I mean, today it's much harder to answer that question than it was, say, a few years ago before the wider war started. And I think, the EU opened an office in Minsk, which I visited. It had a, sort of resident director who was from the Netherlands. And they put up about $30 million in projects in Belarus, a small amount. But it did suggest to me that it was beginning to have some sort of impact. Uh, Sanctions, particularly the ones in 2021, after the hijacking of the Ryanair flight, which I didn't have time to mention, have put an end to this. And now the EU doesn't really have much of a voice in Belarus at the moment. It doesn't mean that trade is entirely stopped, but it's been cut back considerably, um, I'm sure it would reopen again in time, given the geographic location, the proximity to the Baltic states and Poland, as well as Ukraine. And therefore, I think the dependence would be somewhat relieved on Russia, with the caveat that the Europeans don't really have the energy resources to compensate for what would be the loss of Russian oil and gas. Belarus has built a nuclear power station, which has been in operation for a few years. It's got two reactors in operation. The third one is being built, should be ready by about 2035. It's complete. Uh, but it still requires fuel from Russia to run that station. And therefore, you cannot say that it would completely make Belarus energy independent. If the war ends, if Belarus could pull away a little bit, it could depend on nuclear power stations from Europe to add to the dependence on Russian oil and gas. Until recently, though, I mean, even Hungary has been reliant on Russian energy resources as well. I'm not so sure how it will be under its new leader, but that dependence hasn't completely ended, and therefore, I think it's hard to say that Belarus, given its size, given its closeness to Russia, would ever completely pull away from the Russian orbit like Ukraine is trying to do. And therefore, you've got many, many years of Russification, of communication, and the fact that the languages spoken in Belarus today are predominantly Russian in the cities. I mean, it's undeniable that Russian is the main language in the cities. It's not the main language among the exiles, where Belarusian has really taken off. But at the moment it is. So it's an unfortunate situation, and I think um, it will not pull Belarus entirely away from Russia. I wish I could have answered Argamino's question, which is coming next, but I realize we've run out of time. Um, we go back a long way. I'd like to say hi to him as well, and best wishes to Spain in its World Cup campaign. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you. And there are a number of questions. It also shows why you should get your question up quickly. We thank you for taking so many of them, and more than I could have conceived we would cover. I wonder whether you would tell us a bit about your new book and your co-author.
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is the book. It's available, I think, at a reasonable price from Oxford University Press in New York, or in Europe as well. Um, this one was 1895 Canadian. I don't know what it is in Europe and United States. Veronica and I worked on a number of projects together, and actually we were working in 2019 on one on Stalin atrocities in Ukraine, which was cut off simply because of the situation with COVID, and then the election, the protests, the crackdown, the repressions, and her own exile. So instead, we decided to write something that was more general, but which would recover those historical periods that we were studying, and we're trying to integrate the knowledge that we had up to that point, but written in a very accessible style, and part of an Oxford University Press series. Serhiy Kelchik, for example, had written one on Ukraine, which was very successful. So it's called Belarus, What Everyone Needs to Know. And we divided it up between us. And I would say more or less exactly 50% each. There were certain periods that she really wanted to cover. One was the 2020 uprising and the women's role in it, for example. Certain periods I wanted to cover, the Soviet period in particular. And I think it's okay. I think we've done all right with it. And I think it is accessible. And we're hoping that it will be used widely in schools and universities as the kind of go-to textbook. I don't want to play down the new Handbook of Belarus, which is also, excuse me, but I have it somewhere handy. I was going to show that one as well, um, which I can't, unfortunately. But anyway, that one as well, which just came out last year. But now it means that there are at least two books on Belarus that are accessible, and I think there's a number of them. There was one edited by Yelena Korostoleva, Belarus in the 21st Century, that came out of UK. It came out a couple of years ago. So I don't think there's a shortage now. More and more books are being written about Belarus, which is a great thing. Andrew Wilson has revised his original 2011 book as well in 2021. So let's hope for more. And yeah, I advise people to buy it. And if people have questions deriving from this talk, if you send me your email, I will be glad to answer. And you can find mine, I think. But it's basically drmarples@gmail.com will find me, and I will try to answer them. Okay.
Well, thank you. We are pleased that David has joined us as a research fellow at CIUS, and this assures there'll be more attention to Belarus in the future from CIUS. I look forward to finding ways in which we can assist and work together in promoting Belarusian studies as well as Ukrainian studies in the general decolonization movement, whether you choose this term or not. Obviously, there are rethinking going on. And I think ACES in Chicago, but as well as the Canadian Association of Slavists, are making progress, but could be helped along in this. So I once again thank David for his broad and insightful discussion, and no crystal ball. So we will reassemble to see how things begin to work out, but we have a good basis for understanding at the present. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and Viva Belarus.